The mayor didn't give Clara a horse. He gave her a sack of oats, a thin wool blanket, and a pointed finger toward the Bitterroot Ridge. "The Lord don't abide harlots," he had said, refusing to look at her swelling belly. They expected the first winter storm to take her. They expected the wolves to finish the town's dirty work, so they wouldn't have to wash the blood from their own hands. What they didn't expect was Gideon. Oakhaven did not roar its disapproval. It whispered. It shut its doors, pulled its gingham curtains, and turned its collective back. Clara Higgins walked down the center of the muddy thoroughfare, feeling the weight of 100 hidden eyes pressing against her spine. Her boots worn down at the heels from 4 years of scrubbing floors at the Abernathy estate, squelched in the freezing October mud. She carried everything she owned in a flour sack slung over her left shoulder. It wasn't much. 2 spare shifts, a comb missing half its teeth, a tin cup, and a half loaf of stale bread the baker's wife had shoved into her hands before guiltily looking away. She was 5 months gone. The swell of her stomach was undeniable, now straining the buttons of her woolen coat. At the edge of town, past the livery and the last line of split-rail fencing, she paused. Clara didn't look back at the Abernathy house sitting high on its manicured hill. She already knew what was there. Wyatt Abernathy would be standing by the parlor window, likely nursing a glass of his father's bourbon, watching her leave. He had promised her the world in the hayloft. When the doctor confirmed the pregnancy, Wyatt had simply stared at her, his face wiped clean of affection, and told his father the maid had been taking company in the barn. The elder Abernathy had her thrown out before supper. There was no severance. There was no pity. There was only the mayor's decree that a woman of her loose moral constitution was a blight on a God-fearing settlement. The wind picked up, biting through her thin skirts. Clara adjusted the sack and set her sights on the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Ridge. The mountain loomed in the distance, a massive wall of dark pine and grey stone, its peaks already dusted with the season's first snow. There was an old trapping trail that led up into the dense timber. The townspeople spoke of it only to frighten their children. They said a wild man lived up there, a scarred brute, who bought his supplies with pelts and paid in gold dust, speaking to no one. Clara had nowhere else to go. The next town was 40 miles across the open plains, a journey she would never survive on foot with the winter rolling in. The mountain at least had trees. It had shelter if she could find it. And if she died in the timber, at least she wouldn't freeze to death under the self-righteous gaze of the people she had served. The incline began gradually leading her through a valley of dying yellow cottonwoods before the terrain turned hostile. By midday, the trail was nothing more than a rutted track of frozen earth and exposed roots. Her breath came in short, ragged clouds. The muscles in her lower back screamed a deep, radiating ache that made her clench her jaw until her teeth ground together. She stopped to rest against the rough bark of a ponderosa pine, sliding down the trunk until she hit the cold dirt. She pressed a hand to her stomach. A faint flutter answered her palm. "I know," she whispered, her voice cracking in the vast, indifferent silence of the woods. "I know it's cold, just a little further." She didn't know if there was a further. She was walking blindly into the wilderness, driven by the sheer, stubborn refusal to die in Oakhaven's shadow. The afternoon sun dipped behind the ridge, plunging the forest into a sudden deep twilight. The temperature plummeted. Frost began to form on the edges of the dead leaves scattered across the trail. Clara forced herself to her feet. Her legs trembled, feeling entirely unmoored from her body. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. An hour later, the snow began to fall. It wasn't a gentle dusting. It was hard, granular snow that hissed as it hit the pine needles and stung her cheeks. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her exhaustion. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint, eerie luminescence of the snow gathering on the ground. She was stumbling now, her hands out in front of her, catching herself on tree trunks to keep from falling. Then she smelled it. Wood smoke. It was faint, threading through the bitter scent of pine and ice. Clara stopped, lifting her face to the wind. She turned off the main trail, pushing through a thicket of bare brambles that tore at her coat and scratched her hands. A structure materialized out of the gloom. It was a cabin built low to the ground from massive, unpeeled logs. The roof was heavy with sod, and a steady plume of white smoke drifted from a stone chimney. Yellow light bled from the cracks around a heavy wooden door. Clara dragged herself across the clearing. Her boots felt like they were cast in iron. She reached the small covered porch and threw her weight against the door. It didn't budge. She raised her fist and pounded on the rough wood, her knuckles scraping raw against the splinters. "Please!" She gasped, her voice barely carrying over the wind. She hit the door again, her energy completely spent. The cold was no longer biting. It was a heavy, warm blanket settling over her brain. Her knees buckled. Clara slid down the front of the door, her cheek pressing against the freezing timber. The flour sack slipped from her grasp. She curled her body around her stomach, trying to preserve whatever heat was left in her core. The wind howled, burying her tracks in minutes. As the edges of her vision turned black, Clara thought she heard the heavy scrape of a deadbolt sliding back, but the darkness took her before the door even opened. The cold air rushed into the cabin as Gideon pulled the heavy oak door inward. He had his Winchester rifle gripped in one hand, his thumb resting lightly on the hammer. He didn't expect trouble. Trouble rarely climbed 5,000 feet in a snowstorm just to knock on his door. Wolves didn't knock, and bears didn't ask politely. He looked down. A bundle of snow-covered wool lay crumpled on his porch. Gideon lowered the rifle, stepping out into the biting wind. He nudged the bundle with the toe of his boot. It groaned a small, pathetic sound. He crouched, his large hand brushing aside the dusting of snow and pulling back the hood of the coat. A woman. She was young, her face pale as bone lips tinted a dangerous bruised blue. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead with frozen sweat. Gideon swore under his breath, a harsh, gravelly sound in the quiet storm. He didn't want strangers. He had moved up this mountain specifically to ensure the world and its endless complications stayed at a comfortable, insurmountable distance. He grabbed her by the shoulders to pull her up, and as she rolled toward him, his hand brushed the hard, unmistakable swell of her stomach. Gideon froze. He stared at her midsection, then up at her unconscious face. A pregnant woman. Half dead. Miles from anywhere. "Hell," he muttered. He didn't hesitate anymore. He slung the rifle over his shoulder by its leather strap, scooped the woman into his arms, and carried her inside. She weighed nothing. It was like carrying a bundle of dry kindling. He kicked the door shut behind them, throwing the iron deadbolt into place, shutting out the storm. The cabin was a single large room, dominated by a massive stone hearth, where a fire roared, throwing erratic shadows against the log walls. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke rendered tallow, and the sharp tang of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. It was utilitarian. A bed piled thick with bear and elk hides sat in one corner. A sturdy wooden table scarred from skinning knives stood in the center. Gideon laid her on the bed. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering in her sleep. She was freezing from the inside out. Methodically devoid of any delicacy, he went to work. He unbuttoned her sodden wool coat and pulled it off her shoulders, tossing it towards the hearth to steam. Her boots were next, cheap town-made leather soaked clear through. He pulled them off, revealing damp woolen stockings with holes at the heels. Her feet were ice. He grabbed a heavy elk hide from the bottom of the pile and wrapped it tightly around her, tucking the edges under her body to trap the heat. Then he went to the fire. An iron pot hung over the flames, filled with venison broth he'd been simmering since morning. He poured a heavy mug, wrapping a rag around the hot tin handle. He walked back to the bed and sat on the edge. The mattress of pine boughs dipped heavily under his weight. "Wake up," he said. His voice was unused, rusted from weeks of silence. Clara didn't stir. Gideon shifted his grip on the mug and slipped his free hand under the back of her neck, lifting her head. I said, "Wake up." Clara's eyelids fluttered. She dragged in a sharp breath, her eyes snapping open. She stared at him, panic instantly flooding her face. She saw the heavy beard, the jagged, pale scar that cut through his left eyebrow and tracked down to his cheekbone, the sheer imposing breadth of his shoulders blockading her escape. She scrambled backward against the wall, pulling the elk hide up to her chin, her breathing shallow and fast. "Drink it," Gideon said, ignoring her terror. He held out the steaming tin mug. "Before your blood stops moving." Clara stared at the mug, then at his hand. His knuckles were thick, scarred, stained with dirt and soot. She slowly reached out her hands, shaking so badly she could barely grasp the tin. Gideon didn't let go immediately. He guided it to her lips to ensure she didn't spill boiling broth on herself. She took a sip. It was rich, salty, and incredibly hot. It burned down her throat, settling in her stomach like a glowing ember. She took another sip, then grabbed the mug with both hands, drinking greedily until she coughed. "Slow," Gideon commanded, pulling the mug back. "You'll throw it up." Clara leaned back against the log wall, her chest heaving. The warmth of the cabin was beginning to thaw her frozen limbs, turning the numbness into a sharp, prickling agony. She looked around the room, taking in the rifles mounted on the wall, the traps hanging from nails, the utter isolation of the place. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice a raspy whisper. "Bitterroot," Gideon said. He stood up, towering over the bed. "You're a long way from the flatlands, girl. Who dumped you out here?" Clara looked down at the mug in her hands. The shame which she had managed to outrun for the last 10 miles caught up with her. It sat heavy in her throat. "Nobody dumped me." She lied, her voice lacking conviction. "I walked," Gideon scoffed. It was a low, dismissive sound. He crossed the room and picked up her wet coat from the floor near the fire. He held it up. "Cheap wool. Town boots. You walked till you couldn't, then you dragged yourself. And you're carrying a child." He threw the coat over a wooden chair. "Nobody walks up this mountain in October unless they're running from a rope or somebody threw them away." Clara bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," Gideon said, turning back to face her. His dark eyes were hard, entirely unsentimental. "Because I don't run an orphanage and I don't run a boarding house. You survive the night and tomorrow I'm taking you back down." Clara's head snapped up, the fear returning colder than the snow outside. "No, you can't." "I can," Gideon replied evenly. "I live up here for the quiet. You ain't quiet." "If you take me back to Oakhaven," Clara said, her voice dropping to a dead, hollow tone, "they'll let me starve in the street, or they'll drive me out to the plains." She looked him dead in the eye, stripping away her pride because survival demanded it. "If you take me back down there, you might as well just shoot me on the porch." Gideon stared at her. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He looked at the desperate, exhausted woman wrapped in his furs, her hands gripping the tin cup like it was the only solid thing left in the world. He didn't say another word. He just turned, walked back to the hearth, and began to feed another log into the fire. Morning did not arrive with a gentle sunrise. It broke with a blinding, harsh glare, reflecting off 3 feet of fresh powder. Gideon was awake long before the light hit the frost-rimed glass of the cabin's single window. He lay on a bedroll on the hard, packed dirt floor near the hearth, staring up at the smoke-stained rafters. The wind had stopped howling somewhere around midnight. Now the silence was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a mountain buried alive. He threw off his blanket, the cold air immediately biting at his flannel shirt. He fed kindling into the dying embers, his movements methodical and practiced. Within minutes, a small fire licked at the fresh wood. He placed the heavy cast-iron coffee pot on the grate. From the bed in the corner, a soft groan broke the quiet. Gideon didn't turn around. He reached for a chunk of salt pork, taking his hunting knife from his belt, to slice thin, even strips into a skillet. "You alive?" he asked, tossing the meat over the flames. It immediately began to sizzle, filling the cabin with a sharp, greasy smoke. Clara pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her entire body felt like it had been beaten with an iron rod. Her joints screamed in protest, and her head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She pulled the heavy elk hide up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room until they landed on the broad, hunched back of the mountain man. "Yes," she rasped. Her throat felt full of sand. "Good. Don't make a habit of dying in my bed." Gideon picked up a rag, pulled the coffee pot from the fire, and poured a steaming black measure into a tin cup. He set it on the table, then walked to the heavy oak door. He threw the deadbolt and pulled. The door opened about 6 inches before hitting a solid wall of white. Gideon let out a long, slow breath. He pushed harder his boots, finding purchase on the floorboards, but the snowpack was dense and heavy. The storm had blown drifts straight against the front of the cabin, burying the porch completely. He shut the door and shot the bolt back into place. Clara watched him, her knuckles white where she gripped the fur blanket. "What is it? The mountain made a decision." Gideon said, his voice flat. He walked back to the fire and flipped the salt pork. "You ain't going anywhere today. Probably not tomorrow, neither." Relief, sharp and overwhelming, crashed through Clara's chest. She wouldn't have to walk back down. Not today. But the relief was instantly chased by the terrifying reality of her situation. She was trapped in a single room with a strange, scarred man who clearly despised her presence. "I won't be a burden," Clara said quickly, forcing herself to sit up completely. The room spun for a second. She planted her feet on the cold floorboards, wincing as her blisters protested. "I can work. I know how to keep house. I can cook." Gideon turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. His gaze swept over her pale face, her trembling hands, the prominent swell of her belly beneath her rumpled dress. "You can barely stand. I am stronger than I look." She shot back. It wasn't pride speaking. It was survival. In Oakhaven, if you didn't work, you didn't eat. If you became a nuisance, you were discarded. She needed him to see value in her, or he might just throw her out the window into the snow. Gideon snorted. He scraped the fried pork onto a tin plate and grabbed a rock-hard biscuit from a burlap sack, tossing it into the hot grease to soften. "Sit down before you fall down. The coffee's on the table." Clara stood up. Her legs wobbled, but they held. She walked to the table, her bare feet making soft padding sounds on the floor. She picked up the tin cup, welcoming the searing heat against her palms. She took a sip. The coffee was atrocious, bitter, gritty, and thick as mud. She drank it without a word. Gideon brought the plate over and set it in front of her. 2 strips of pork, 1 grease-soaked biscuit. He didn't bring a plate for himself. "Eat," he ordered. "What about you?" she asked, eyeing the small portion. "I ate before the sun came up." It was a lie. Clara knew it was a lie. The fire had been dead, the skillet cold. But she also knew better than to argue with a man offering his food. She sat on the rough-hewn bench and tore off a piece of the biscuit, chewing the salty, heavy dough. It tasted better than anything she had ever eaten. Gideon walked over to a corner piled with trapping gear. He pulled on a heavy canvas coat lined with sheepskin, then grabbed a flat-edged iron shovel leaning against the wall. "I have to dig out the chimney and the woodshed. You stay inside. Don't touch the rifles. Don't let the fire go out." Clara nodded, her mouth full of pork. He unlatched the door, wedged the shovel into the crack, and began the arduous task of hacking away the snowdrift. The cold air poured in, biting and sharp, but Clara barely felt it. She watched the muscles in his back bunch and flex beneath his coat as he threw heavy loads of snow out into the blinding white yard. He was a brute of a man. Everything about him was jagged edges and rough surfaces. But as he worked, Clara looked down at her empty plate. He had given her his breakfast. He had given her his bed. In Oakhaven, the fine gentlemen in their tailored suits had given her nothing but ruin. Here in the frozen middle of nowhere, the monster was keeping her warm. 3 days passed in a suffocating white silence. The snow did not melt. The temperature hovered near zero, freezing the top layer of the drifts into a hard, crystalline crust. The cabin became a pressure cooker of unspoken rules and avoiding eye contact. Gideon spent most of his daylight hours outside splitting wood with a relentless punishing rhythm or checking snares he had set in the tree line behind the cabin. When he was inside, he was a ghost. He sat by the fire whittling down pine stakes or oiling his rifle, speaking only to issue short, necessary instructions. More water in the pot. Hand me that rag. Move your boots. Clara did not sit idle. She refused to. By the morning of the 4th day, the soreness in her muscles had faded to a manageable ache. She found a bundle of rough spun yarn and a bone needle in a small wooden box near the hearth. Gideon's spare shirts, heavy flannel, and canvas were piled in a crate, most of them missing buttons, or sporting jagged tears from branches and claws. Clara took the crate to the table. She sat by the window to catch the pale, watery winter light, and began to sew. She worked mechanically, her fingers finding their old rhythm. 4 years at the Abernathy house had taught her how to make a seamless mend. She didn't mind the work. It kept her mind from drifting back to the valley, to the sneers of the townswomen, to Wyatt's cold, dead eyes. Gideon stomped into the cabin around noon. He kicked the snow from his boots against the doorframe, carrying 2 skinned rabbits by their hind legs. The carcasses were frozen stiff. He tossed them onto the skinning table in the corner, wiping a smudge of blood from his jaw. He stopped when he saw Clara. She had finished 3 shirts. They were neatly folded at the edge of the table, the tiers pulled tight with precise, even stitches. She was currently working on a thick wool sock, weaving the yarn across a massive hole in the heel. Gideon walked over his heavy boots loud against the floorboards. He picked up one of the folded shirts. He inspected the seam on the shoulder where a stray branch had nearly ripped the sleeve clean off a month ago. The stitching was tight. Professional. "I didn't ask you to do that," he said, dropping the shirt back onto the pile. "I didn't ask for your bed," Clara replied, not looking up from the sock. "We all have debts." Gideon frowned. He walked over to the hearth and grabbed the coffee pot, shaking it. It was empty. Before he could speak, Clara pointed her needle toward a cast-iron kettle sitting on a trivet near the coals. "I made tea," she said quietly. "Pine needles and dried rose hips from that jar on the top shelf. It's better for your stomach than boiling those same coffee grounds a 4th time." Gideon stared at her. He looked at the kettle, then back at Clara. He poured a cup of the pale yellow liquid. He took a cautious sip. It was tart-sharp and cut cleanly through the stale taste of tobacco and grease in his mouth. He didn't say thank you. He just took the cup to the skinning table, grabbed his knife, and began to butcher the rabbits. "You got hands like a dock worker," Gideon said abruptly, his back to her, as the knife sliced cleanly through bone and cartilage. Clara paused, her needle hovering over the wool. She looked down at her hands. The skin was rough, the knuckles chapped and red. Calluses thick as leather covered her palms from years of gripping scrub brushes with lye soap. "I was a maid," Clara said, her voice tight. "At the Abernathy estate. I cleaned the floors, I hauled the water, I scrubbed their clothes until my fingers bled." "And the father?" Gideon asked. It wasn't a gentle question, it was a tactical one. He wanted to know the shape of the ghost that had chased her up his mountain. Clara's jaw tightened. She shoved the needle aggressively through the thick wool. "The father is a coward, and he's dead to me." Gideon tossed a butchered hindquarter into the stew pot. "Rich boy, got his fun in the hay, got caught, and pointed the finger at the hired help. Tale as old as dirt." Clara slammed the sock down on the table. "I am not looking for your pity, mister. I know what I am. I know what the town thinks I am." She pressed a hand firmly against her stomach, a defensive, maternal gesture. "But this child is mine, and I will not let them kill it just to keep their parlor rooms respectable." The cabin fell silent. Only the crackle of the fire and the wet sound of meat hitting the bottom of the iron pot filled the space. Gideon turned around. He wiped his bloody knife on a rag. His dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the defensive anger she was trying to project. He didn't see a harlot. He saw a terrified, exhausted girl backed into a corner, baring her teeth. "Nobody's killing anybody," Gideon said quietly. The gravel in his voice had smoothed out just a fraction. "Not up here." Clara swallowed hard, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had flared. She looked away, staring out the frosted window at the endless expanse of dead white snow. Suddenly she gasped. Her hand clamped down hard on her stomach. She doubled over slightly, her face going pale. Gideon dropped the rag. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his massive frame looming over the table. "What is it, the baby?" Clara closed her eyes, taking a slow, shaky breath. She waited a moment, then opened her eyes, a faint, disbelieving smile touching the corners of her mouth. "He kicked," she whispered. She looked up at Gideon. The mountain man was staring at her stomach as if it were a primed stick of dynamite. The scar on his face twitched. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting distance between himself and the terrifying reality of creating life. "I'll go chop more wood," Gideon muttered, turning sharply toward the door. Clara watched him practically flee the cabin. As the door slammed shut, leaving her alone with the warmth of the fire, she rested both hands on her belly. For the first time since she was thrown out of Oakhaven, the cold dread in her chest began to thaw. November bled into December without fanfare. The Bitterroot Ridge locked itself away beneath a permanent shell of ice. Daylight became a scarce commodity, appearing late in the morning as a weak grey smudge and retreating behind the peaks by mid-afternoon. Inside the cabin, a silent rhythm took hold. Clara no longer huddled in the corner. She claimed the space around the hearth. She took inventory of Gideon's meager larder-dried beans, salted pork venison jerky, and root vegetables buried in a cold box beneath the floorboards. She stretched his rations with a desperate ingenuity learned in the Abernathy kitchens. She made thick stews thickened with cornmeal. She baked dense, heavy loaves of bread in the Dutch oven, the smell of yeast and hot iron filling the cramped space, and chasing away the smell of cured hides. Gideon didn't comment on the changes. He simply ate what was put in front of him. But he stopped leaving his dirty boots by the fire, kicking them off on the porch instead. He started bringing in 2 buckets of water from the frozen creek every morning unprompted, so Clara wouldn't have to carry the heavy loads. They were small concessions. They were monumental shifts. One evening the wind was screaming down the chimney, sending puffs of wood smoke into the room. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands pressing into the small of her back. The dull ache there was constant now. She was 6 months along, and the child was restless, pressing heavily against her ribs. She watched Gideon. He sat on a low stool by the fire, a thick block of seasoned oak clamped between his knees. He was working a draw knife across the wood, peeling away long, curling ribbons of timber. He had been at it for 3 nights. The floor around him was littered with pale shavings. "You're wasting good firewood," Clara noted, shifting her weight to find a comfortable position. There wasn't one. Gideon didn't look up. He rotated the oak, the blade making a satisfying, rhythmic shh sound as it bit into the grain. "It ain't firewood." "Then what is it?" He paused, resting the draw knife across his thighs. He picked up a rag and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He looked at her, his eyes dropping briefly to her swollen belly before meeting her gaze. "A chair," he said simply. "You sit on that bed like a perched owl. It's bad for your spine. A woman carrying weight needs a proper backrest." Clara swallowed. The sudden prickle of tears caught her completely off guard. She blinked them away quickly, staring hard at the fire. Wyatt Abernathy had bought her a silver comb once, a hollow token to keep her quiet. Gideon was carving a chair out of a raw stump so her back wouldn't hurt. "Thank you." She managed, her voice thick. Gideon grunted. He picked up the knife and resumed his work. The scrape of the blade filled the silence for a long time. "The scar," Clara said suddenly. She hadn't meant to ask. The isolation was loosening her tongue, eroding the polite boundaries that kept her safe. Was it a bear? The drawknife stopped. Gideon stared at the piece of oak. For a moment Clara thought he was going to tell her to shut her mouth. The muscles in his jaw locked tightly beneath his beard. Then he set the knife down on the hearthstones. "Silver mine," he said. His voice was distant, stripped of its usual gruff edge. "Down in Nevada territory. 5 years ago." He reached up his thick fingers, lightly touching the jagged, pale line that bisected his eyebrow and tore down his cheek. "We hit a bad seam. Soft rock. The shoring timbers buckled like matchsticks." Gideon stared into the flames, the firelight catching the old anger in his eyes. "The ceiling came down, buried 12 of us in the dark, pinned my head against a granite slab." Clara stopped breathing. She pictured the suffocating blackness, the crushing weight of the earth. "How did you get out?" "I dug," Gideon said flatly. "With my hands. For 2 days. The company, they didn't send a rescue crew right away. Digging costs money. Halt in production costs money. They figured we were dead, so they took their time." He looked at Clara, his expression completely barren. "When I broke through the rubble, only 3 of us were still breathing. I walked out of that shaft, collected my pay, and rode north until the town stopped. Until the people stopped." Clara looked down at her hands, her rough red knuckles. She understood. She understood it down to her marrow. "They weigh us," she whispered. Gideon frowned. "What, the people with the money? The people with the clean houses?" Clara lifted her head, meeting his gaze. "They put us on a scale. Our lives, our sweat, our blood. They weigh it against their profit, against their reputation. And if we come up short, they bury us. In a mine, or in the snow." Gideon stared at her. The silence that stretched between them wasn't cold. It was the heavy, settling quiet of shared understanding. He saw the firelight reflecting in her dark eyes, the fierce, unbroken spirit burning behind them. She wasn't just a stray he had pulled from the cold. She was a survivor, just like him. He picked up the drawknife. "You'll have this chair by Sunday," Gideon said. He went back to work, and for the first time since she arrived, Clara laid down on the bed, pulled the furs over her shoulder, and slept through the night without waking once. January arrived with teeth. The cold was no longer an inconvenience. It was an active, malicious force pressing against the log walls. Frost grew thick on the inside of the window panes, obscuring the world outside. The cabin felt smaller. Clara was heavily pregnant now, her movements slow and cumbersome. The rocking chair Gideon had built sat by the fire, polished smooth by her constant use. It was a sturdy, unlovely thing, built for endurance rather than aesthetics, which made it perfectly suited for the cabin. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Clara was boiling a pot of snow on the hearth for washing her heavy woolen skirt, pinned up out of the soot. Gideon was at the table running an oiled rag over the mechanism of his Winchester. Then the silence broke. It wasn't the wind. It was a sharp, rhythmic crunch. Snow compressing under heavy weight. Gideon's head snapped up. His hand left the oily rag and instantly closed around the receiver of the rifle. He stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floorboards. He moved to the window, scraping a clear patch in the frost with his thumb. Clara froze the wooden stirring spoon halfway to her mouth. An animal. No. Gideon said softly. He levered around into the chamber. The metallic clack-clack sounded like a cannon shot in the quiet room. 2 legs, leading a horse. Fear, sudden and icy, flooded Clara's chest. Her hand instinctively flew to her stomach. The mountain was supposed to be empty. It was supposed to be a fortress. A heavy fist pounded on the oak door. "Hello, the cabin." A voice muffled by the thick wood called out. "Open up. It's the law." Clara's breath hitched. The law. Oakhaven. They had come for her. She backed away from the hearth, retreating toward the shadowed corner of the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Gideon didn't look at her. He walked to the door, the Winchester held casually at his hip, but the muzzle angled toward the wood. He threw the deadbolt and pulled the door open just wide enough to fill the frame with his massive shoulders. Cold air poured into the room, bringing with it the scent of wet wool and horse sweat. Standing on the cleared porch was Deputy Miller. He was a vicious, petty man from Oakhaven, a man who enjoyed wearing a tin badge because it gave him an excuse to carry a badge and a gun. His face was wrapped in a scarf, his mustache frozen into solid icicles. "Bitter cold mountain man," Miller said, stamping his boots. "Tracked a rustled mare up the lower ridge, lost the trail in the drifts. Need to warm my bones before I head back down." Gideon didn't move. He blocked the doorway entirely. "You're off your jurisdiction, Miller. Town law ends at the valley floor." "Now don't be unneighborly," Miller sneered, trying to peer around Gideon's bulk. "I just need 10 minutes by the fire. Mayor's orders. Keep an eye on the high country." Miller shoved his shoulder forward, attempting to push past. Gideon stood like a rooted pine. He didn't budge an inch. But the movement shifted the angle just enough for Miller to see into the cabin. The deputy's eyes locked onto Clara standing frozen by the bed. His face broke into a slow, ugly grin. "Well, I'll be damned." Miller chuckled. "The Abernathy stray. The whole town figured the wolves had picked your bones clean by now, Clara. Wyatt will be tickled to know his mess is still breathing." He looked back at Gideon, his eyes glinting with malicious amusement. "You running a charity ward up here, Trapper, or did you just need a warm body for the winter?" Gideon's reaction was instantaneous. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He reached out with his free hand, clamped his thick fingers onto the heavy wool of Miller's coat, and violently threw the man backward. Miller hit the snow-covered yard hard, losing his footing and sprawling onto his back. His hat flew off into a snowdrift. He scrambled his hand, dropping toward the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his hip. Gideon stepped out onto the porch. The Winchester was now leveled dead at Miller's chest. The hammer was back. "Touch the iron," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly rumble. "Give me the excuse." Miller froze. His hand hovered an inch from the walnut grip of his pistol. He looked at the scarred giant on the porch, looking into eyes that held absolutely zero hesitation. Gideon wasn't bluffing. He was waiting. "You're making a mistake, Gideon." Miller spat slowly, raising his hands, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Mayor don't like outlaws. He don't like people harboring town trash. She ain't town trash." Gideon said the words, cutting through the cold like a whip. "She's under my roof. She eats my food. She's my responsibility." He stepped off the porch, the rifle never wavering. "This mountain is mine. You take one more step up this ridge, Miller, and I won't bury you. I'll leave you for the crows. Now get on your horse." Miller scrambled to his feet, keeping his hands visible. He snatched his hat from the snow and backed toward his exhausted horse. He pulled himself into the saddle, his face red with a mixture of cold and humiliated rage. "You'll regret this," Miller shouted over the wind. "Both of you." He kicked the horse, spurring it back down the buried trail. Gideon stood in the snow, watching the deputy until the grey timber swallowed him whole. When he finally turned back, Clara was standing in the doorway. She was trembling, gripping the doorframe so hard her knuckles were white. The illusion of safety had been shattered. Oakhaven knew she was alive. Gideon walked past her, kicking the snow off his boots. He pushed the door shut and slid the deadbolt home with a heavy final thud. He uncocked the rifle and set it on the table. Clara stared at him. "They'll come back. Gideon walked over to the hearth. He picked up a heavy log and threw it onto the fire. Sparks showered violently against the stone. He turned to face her, his massive frame silhouetted by the flames. "Let them," he said. The days following Deputy Miller's departure were stripped of all pretense. The quiet domesticity they had forged over the winter dissolved into a grim, purposeful industry. Gideon did not just split firewood. He fortified. He spent 2 days dragging heavy, unpeeled pine logs across the frozen yard, burying them upright in the snowpack beneath the front window to create a solid timber blind. Inside the cabin, the smell of venison stew was replaced by the acrid, sulphurous stench of melting lead. Gideon sat by the hearth for hours, an iron crucible nestled in the red-hot coals, methodically pouring the liquid metal into a brass bullet mold. Clara watched him from the rocking chair. Her belly was a tight, heavy drum. It was late February. The child sat agonizingly low in her pelvis, pressing against her hips, with a relentless weight that made simply standing up a monumental task. She watched the muscles in Gideon's forearms flex as he clipped the sprues from the freshly cast bullets, his face a hard, unreadable mask in the firelight. "They won't send an army," Clara said quietly, breaking a silence that had lasted since dawn. "Oakhaven doesn't have the stomach for a war in the snow. They'll send Miller and a few drunks from the saloon." Gideon didn't look up. He dropped a shiny silver-grey slug into a leather pouch. "Bullets don't care if the man firing them is drunk. They punch through log walls just the same." He stood up, wiping his soot-stained hands on his canvas trousers. He walked over to the corner where his trapping gear was piled and pulled out a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun. The stock was scarred, the twin barrels truncated to a brutal, efficient length. He broke the action open, checking the empty chambers, and walked over to Clara. He held it out to her stock first. Clara stared at the weapon. Her hands resting on her swollen stomach instinctively tightened into fists. "I don't know how to use that." "You learn today," Gideon stated. He didn't retract his arms. He stood there until she slowly reached out and took the heavy oiled weapon. It was heavier than it looked, the cold steel biting into her palms. Gideon pulled up his stool and sat facing her. "I'm going to be outside when they come. I need to keep them in the tree line. If they get past me or if I go down, they're coming through that door. You don't hesitate. You don't ask them what they want. They already told us what they want." He reached out his thick, calloused fingers, guiding her hands to the proper positions on the stock and the forend. His touch was devoid of romance, purely instructional, yet it was the most grounding physical contact she had experienced in months. "Thumb on the hammers," he instructed, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Pull them back until they click." Both of them. Clara struggled. The springs were heavy. She had to use the meat of her thumb and press hard, gritting her teeth until the twin mechanisms locked into place with a sharp, metallic snap. "Good. Now the triggers." Gideon tapped her index finger. "Front trigger fires the right barrel. Back trigger fires the left. Don't pull them both at once unless you want a broken collarbone. You don't aim this thing, Clara. You point it at the center of the doorway and you clear the room." Clara looked down at the twin black holes of the barrels, then up into Gideon's eyes. "If I shoot a man, they'll hang me. If you don't shoot," Gideon said, his expression hardening, "they'll take the child, and they'll leave you to bleed out on these floorboards. The law down there is written by men like Abernathy. Up here the law is whatever keeps you breathing for another 10 seconds. He took the shotgun back, gently uncocking the hammers, and set it against the wall within arm's reach of the rocking chair. He placed 2 thick brass-cased shells on the small table next to it. "Load it when you hear the first shot," he said. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the heavy wooden shutters Gideon had bolted over the glass window. Clara lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The baby was restless, kicking sharply against her ribs, as if it could sense the tension suffocating the cabin. Gideon was asleep on his bedroll by the fire, his Winchester resting across his chest. He slept like a stray dog, eyes closed, but fully aware his breathing shallow and even. Clara turned heavily onto her side. "Gideon," she whispered. The breathing stopped. "Yeah." "Why didn't you just let him take me?" she asked. The question had been rotting in her chest for weeks. "Miller, you could have handed me over. You could have had your quiet mountain back." Gideon didn't move for a long time. The fire popped, throwing a shower of sparks into the dark. When the roof collapsed in the Nevada shaft, Gideon said, his voice sounding like dry gravel in the quiet room, "The man pinned next to me was a kid, barely 19. Irish boy. Both his legs were crushed. I held his hand for 14 hours in the pitch black. He begged me to keep talking. He begged me not to let the silence take him." Clara listened, her breath catching in her throat. "I kept talking," Gideon continued. "But the silence took him anyway. He bled out before the second day." Gideon slowly sat up, turning to look at her from across the room. The firelight caught the jagged edge of his scar. "I ain't handing nobody over to the dark again, Clara. Not if I have breath in my lungs. You're staying right here." He laid back down. Clara pulled the heavy elk hide up to her chin, the tears finally spilling over hot and silent against the coarse fur. The storm broke on the 2nd of March. It wasn't snow this time. It was a vicious, freezing rain that coated the Bitterroot Ridge in a thick, treacherous layer of slick ice. The trees groaned under the weight branches, snapping with sounds like rifle fire in the grey light of dawn. Inside the cabin, Clara gripped the edge of the wooden table, her knuckles white. A low, guttural moan escaped her lips as a wave of agonizing pressure ripped through her lower back and wrapped around her abdomen. It wasn't the dull ache she had grown accustomed to. It was a sharp, violent contraction that stole the oxygen from the room. Gideon dropped the chunk of firewood he was carrying. He crossed the room in 3 strides, catching Clara by the elbow as her knees buckled. "It's time," she gasped, her fingernails digging brutally into his forearm. "Gideon, it's time." Gideon's face went pale beneath his beard. He was a man who understood broken bones, gunshot wounds, and frostbite. This was an entirely different battlefield. He scooped her up, his massive arms supporting her weight easily, and carried her to the bed. "All right," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "All right, just breathe. I'll get the water boiling." He turned toward the hearth, but before he could take a step, the sound of splintering wood echoed from the yard. It wasn't a tree branch. It was the heavy crunch of an iron-shod hoof breaking through the ice crust. Gideon froze. He looked at the heavy oak door, then back at Clara. She was curled on her side, panting heavily, her face slick with sweat. "Gideon," she whispered, panic replacing the pain in her eyes. He didn't answer. He lunged for the Winchester, leaning against the table, racking around into the chamber. He moved to the window, sliding open a small 2-inch viewing slit he had carved into the shutter. Through the freezing rain he saw them. 5 men on horseback, their mounts blowing heavy clouds of steam into the frigid air. They were clustered near the tree line. Deputy Miller was in the front, his rifle resting across his saddle pommel. Beside him sat Wyatt Abernathy, wrapped in a heavy, expensive fur coat, looking terrified and deeply out of place. "Trapper." Miller's voice carried over the sound of the sleet, distorted by the wind. "We know she's in there. Mayor signed a warrant for the Abernathy property. Wyatt's here to claim his blood. Send the girl out and we ride away." Gideon looked back at the bed. Clara let out another cry, her back arching as a fresh contraction seized her. There was a dark, wet stain spreading across the furs beneath her. Her water had broken. There was no time. There was no negotiation. Gideon walked over to the bed. He picked up the sawed-off shotgun from the wall and laid it directly across Clara's chest. He placed her trembling hand over the grip. "Do not let them in." Gideon said, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, terrifying intensity. He walked to the heavy oak door. He didn't shout back. He didn't issue a warning. Gideon threw the deadbolt, kicked the door open, and stepped out onto the porch into the freezing rain. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder in one fluid, practiced motion. He didn't aim for the men. He aimed for the ground directly in front of Miller's horse. He pulled the trigger. The rifle roared, spitting a massive gout of flame into the grey morning. The bullet shattered a frozen stump inches from the horse's hooves. The animal screamed, rearing up wildly. Miller shouted, losing his grip on his rifle as he fought to stay in the saddle. "That's your only warning." Gideon roared, his voice echoing off the mountain like thunder. "Next one takes your head off." Chaos erupted. Two of the men in the back, hired hands from the livery, panicked and spurred their horses, attempting to flee back down the trail. Wyatt Abernathy was fighting his own mount, his face pale with terror. But Miller recovered. He drew his Colt revolver and fired blindly towards the cabin. The heavy lead slug slammed into the doorframe, sending a shower of sharp wooden splinters into Gideon's cheek. Gideon didn't flinch. He worked the lever of the Winchester, the empty brass casing spinning away into the sleet. He tracked the movement of the hired man, flanking to the left, and fired. The man's horse went down, throwing its rider hard into the icy brush. Inside the cabin, Clara screamed. It was a primal, tearing sound that pierced straight through the gunfire. Gideon's heart hammered against his ribs. He couldn't stay outside. He fired 2 more rapid shots into the tree line to force the men into cover, then stepped backward, slamming the heavy door shut and throwing the iron bolt. A bullet punched through the wooden shutter, shattering the glass behind it and thudding into the ceiling logs. Gideon dropped the rifle and fell to his knees beside the bed. Clara was gasping for air, her hands gripping the sheets so hard her knuckles were splitting. "I can't—" She sobbed, her eyes wild with agony and terror. "Gideon, they're going to kill us!" "Nobody is dying today." Gideon snarled. He pushed her knees apart, his bloody hands trembling for the first time since she had met him. "Push, Clara. You have to push now." Outside, heavy boots crunched on the icy porch. Someone slammed their weight against the door. The hinges groaned, but the heavy oak held fast. "Open the damn door, trapper!" Miller screamed from the other side. A shotgun blast tore through the center of the wood, sending deadly buckshot tearing through the cabin. A pellet grazed Gideon's shoulder, tearing through his flannel and biting into the meat. He didn't stop. He ignored the burning pain, keeping his eyes locked on Clara. "Push!" he commanded, his voice drowning out the chaos outside. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, threw her head back, and poured every ounce of her remaining strength, every ounce of her rage, and every ounce of her will to survive into one massive, earth-shattering push. Another gunshot rang out, deafeningly loud. But it wasn't from outside. The heavy oak door splintered inward as Miller kicked it, the deadbolt tearing free from the frame. The deputy stood in the doorway, his Colt raised. Clara's eyes snapped open. She didn't think. She let go of the sheets, her right hand finding the stock of the sawed-off shotgun resting on her chest. She pointed the twin barrels blindly towards the doorway and jerked the front trigger. The recoil nearly dislocated her shoulder. The roar of the shotgun inside the small cabin was apocalyptic. Miller was thrown backward out the door as if he had been struck by a runaway train, disappearing into the sleet and the white fog. In the ringing silence that followed, a new sound filled the cabin. It was high, thin, and piercingly loud. It was the sound of furious, indignant life. Gideon knelt by the foot of the bed, his chest heaving, his shoulder bleeding. Cradled in his massive, soot-stained, blood-smeared hands was a small, squalling infant. Clara let the empty shotgun slide to the floorboards. She looked at the giant of a man, holding her child, the freezing wind howling through the shattered doorway, and she finally exhaled. The baby's cry cut through the suffocating stench of sulfur and copper. It was a violent, demanding sound echoing off the blood-spattered walls of the cabin. Gideon didn't move for a long second. He stayed on his knees, his massive, bloodied hands cradling the slippery, squalling weight of the newborn. He stared down at the child, his chest heaving, the gunshot graze on his shoulder, dripping a steady rhythm of red onto the floorboards. "Give him to me!" Clara gasped. Her voice was a ragged, exhausted thread, but the command in it was absolute. Gideon blinked, the trance breaking. He reached for a clean, worn flannel shirt he had set near the foot of the bed hours ago. He wrapped the infant with clumsy, trembling care, swaddling the boy tight to preserve the heat. He stood up his knees, popping in the quiet room, and gently laid the bundle on Clara's chest. Clara's arms shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and agony clamped around the child. She pulled him beneath the heavy elk hide, resting her chin against the top of his damp head. The baby rooted blindly against her skin, the piercing cries softening into frustrated grunts. Outside, the wind howled through the splintered ruin of the oak door. Gideon picked up his Winchester. He stepped over the shattered wood and out onto the freezing porch. The sleet hit his face like ground glass. Deputy Miller lay on his back at the bottom of the porch steps. The double-aught buckshot had caught him high in the chest. He wasn't dead, but his breathing was a wet, shallow rattle, and the snow beneath him was already melting into a wide, dark pool. 20 yards away near the tree line, Wyatt Abernathy sat frozen on his horse. The expensive fur coat he wore was soaked through. The hired men had already fled their tracks, filling with ice. Wyatt stared at Miller, then slowly lifted his eyes to the porch. He saw Gideon. The mountain man was a terrifying vision shirt, torn, bleeding his beard, matted with sweat, and sawdust holding the rifle with a terrifying casual stillness. "Wyatt!" Gideon called out. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a flat, dead calm that carried perfectly over the sleet. Wyatt flinched his hands, strangling the leather reins. "She ain't yours anymore," Gideon said. "This child ain't yours. This mountain ain't yours." He jacked the lever of the Winchester, the mechanical clack slicing through the storm. "You ride back to Oakhaven. You tell your father the Maid is dead. You tell the mayor his deputy got lost in the drifts. If I ever see a man from your valley cross the timberline again, I won't stop at the porch. I will burn your fine house to the foundations with you in it." Wyatt didn't say a word. The arrogance of the valley, the entitlement of his name, it all dissolved in the face of absolute, unblinking consequence. He yanked his horse around so hard the animal stumbled, then spurred it mercilessly back down the trail, disappearing into the grey fog. Gideon watched until the sound of the hooves faded completely. He looked down at Miller. The wet rattling had stopped. The deputy's eyes were fixed permanently on the falling sleet. Gideon dragged the body off the trail and behind the woodshed. The ground was too frozen for a grave. The wolves would have to clean up the town's mess. He returned to the cabin, dragging a heavy wooden shipping crate from the corner. He wedged it into the broken doorway, nailing it directly into the frame with heavy iron spikes to seal out the storm. It was ugly, but it blocked the wind. He threw 3 massive logs onto the fire building the blaze until the heat in the room was stifling, driving the winter back into the dark. Hours later, the cabin was quiet. The sleet had turned back to a heavy, silent snow. Gideon sat on his stool by the hearth. He had peeled off his ruined shirt. He was holding a needle threaded with thick cat gut. His teeth gritted as he tried to reach across his chest to stitch the jagged bullet graze on his left shoulder. His fingers were too thick, the angle too awkward. "Stop," Clara said. Gideon paused, the needle hovering over torn flesh. He looked toward the bed. Clara was sitting up, leaning against the sturdy oak chair Gideon had built for her. The baby was asleep in the crook of her arm, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The color had returned to her face, replacing the stark terror with a deep, settling calm. "Come here," she said. Gideon stood. He walked over to the bed and sat on the very edge of the pine frame. He handed her the needle and the cat gut. Clara shifted her weight. She didn't hesitate. Her rough, calloused fingers, the hands of a maid, the hands of a survivor, pinched the edges of the torn flesh together. She pushed the needle through. Gideon's jaw locked tight, but he didn't make a sound. "You didn't have to go out there," Clara said softly, pulling the first stitch taut. "You could have barricaded the door. You could have stayed inside. He was on my porch. Gideon replied gruffly. He was looking for me. Clara tied off the knot and snipped the gut with a small pair of iron shears. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. You gave us a home, Gideon, when the whole world decided we weren't worth the air. Gideon looked down at the sleeping infant. The boy had a shock of dark hair, just like his mother. He reached out his massive, scarred index finger, hovering over the child. The baby stirred a tiny, perfectly formed hand, blindly reaching out and wrapping tightly around Gideon's thick knuckle. The mountain man's breath caught. The ice that had calcified around his chest for 5 years cracked, fracturing down to the root. He needs a name, Clara whispered. Gideon stared at the tiny hand gripping his own. He thought of the dark mine in Nevada. He thought of the suffocating silence. And then he looked at the warmth of the fire reflecting in Clara's eyes. Caleb, Gideon said, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming weight. It means devotion to the things that matter. Clara smiled. It was a small, exhausted, fiercely beautiful thing. She leaned her head against Gideon's uninjured shoulder. Caleb, she repeated softly. Outside, the mountain stood silent and indifferent. But inside the cabin, the heavy oak door was nailed shut, the hearth fire roared, and the roots had finally taken hold. If you felt the heat of the hearth and the sheer grit of Clara and Gideon's survival, hit that like button. This wasn't just a story about surviving the winter. It was about finding humanity in the harshest places when society turns its back. Share this video with anyone who loves a deeply emotional, action-packed Western tale. Do you think Oakhaven will ever truly leave them alone, or have they finally carved out their permanent peace on the Bitterroot Ridge? Subscribe to the channel for more grounded, gritty stories of frontier survival and untamed romance.